Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa Schwartz with Berkeley Lab. Welcome to the first of 5 webinars this year on the Distributed Energy Resource Interconnection Roadmap. It was recently published by the U.S. Department of Energy's Interconnection Innovation e-Xchange, or I2X. The roadmap identifies a wide range of solutions to address challenges for interconnecting energy resources at both the distribution level and sub-transmission grid. I2X advances open dialogue among diverse stakeholders on interconnection challenges, bridges knowledge gaps, and supports practical solutions. DOE's Solar Energy Technologies Office is supporting Berkeley Lab to help advance solutions identified in the roadmap. So in addition to this webinar series, we're conducting several studies on interconnection timelines and costs, automation of interconnection processes, allocation of interconnection costs, and using innovative technologies to evolve interconnection procedures. We're also developing a publicly available web portal to provide DER interconnection queue data from across the United States where it's available, and providing training and technical assistance for state agencies. Next slide, please. So today, our focus is on improving interconnection processes and associated timelines. First up is a presentation by Ken Habel, Manager of Distributed Generation Connections at Sacramento Municipal Utility District, or SMUD. Katie Cleary, Project Manager for Commercial Distributed Generation, will join Ken for Q&A. And then Hanna Terwilliger and Derek Duran of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission will present on their state's efforts to improve DER interconnection processes. Catherine Chelminsky with Berkeley Lab will kick off Q&A for the panelists, and then we'll get to your questions and comments. We have 2 hours, so we have plenty of time for discussion. Next slide. So first, some housekeeping items. This meeting is being recorded. The slides are posted, and a recording will be posted soon. We'll put the link in the chat box. Please enter your questions for panelists at any time using the Q&A box. We'll take clarifying questions after each presentation, but we're going to hold other questions and comments until both presentations are completed. You also can feel free to use the chat box if you want to make comments. We'll be capturing those. And if you want to ask a question or make a comment live, go to the reactions section in Zoom and select the raise hand feature. We'll call on you by name and unmute you to speak. Catherine?
Catherine, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisa. Catherine Chelminsky here. The DOE I2X DER Interconnection Roadmap provides a guide of actions to take over the next 5 to 10 years to implement solutions designed to address DER interconnection challenges. The focus of this webinar today is improving interconnection process and timelines. Solutions outlined in the roadmap to improve process and timelines include providing pre-application materials, establishing commercial readiness requirements, implementing automation, and addressing workforce needs. To learn more about I2X events and resources, you can scan the QR code in the slide here with your phone or use the link that we will share in the chat box. Now we will turn to, we have now we will turn to our presenters today. We have Ken Habel and Katie Cleary from the Sacramento Municipal Utility District presenting first. So I will switch presentations quickly here. Bear with me a moment.
Catherine, I thought Hanna was going to present her own slides. Oh, it's mine
first. All right. All right, over to you, Ken.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for hosting this webinar and including us. My name is Ken Habel. I'm the manager of Distributed Interconnection Generation. My team's primary role is to manage the process end-to-end, whether it's a commercial or residential application. Things that fall out of the process, our team's there to help move things along. bottlenecks, and reach out to customers, set expectations and next steps, etc. Along with me is Katie Cleary. She is the commercial interconnection PM. Well, for transmission, she used to do commercial. SMUD considers it 69 kV within the transmission space. I know a lot of folks on this consider that sub-transmission, but just want to level set where we're at. So anything that is a commercial, whether it's a SMB customer, all the way up to our key and majors, Katie and that team would handle that portion of the process after my team accepts the original application from sizing perspective, etc. So she's here to answer any questions that I cannot cover, and appreciate your time as well, Katie, for jumping on. So next slide, please. So I took the main bullet points of what we were asked to discuss and try to lump them into one major section here to really cover a lot of the bases. So the most effective way to expedite our timelines, managing varying queues, driven by market, supply chain, a bunch of different things that come into play, and addressing the speed of the market, not just for residential customers, but for all. So 2015 to 2016 era, that's when the original SB1 funds or the California initiatives that were paying for customers to install rooftop solar was coming to an end. So with that in light, our executive team and senior leaders got together and said, we need to move from a programmatic state because of the removal of incentives and move it to an operational state. During that process, that was very much key. If we don't have your senior leadership buy-in to the process and what you're going to do and that alignment, you're going to hit barriers at some point and you're going to stall. I've seen different variations of this thing, of these processes and change management projects coming into play. And that's always a risk, that you don't have the operational alignment when you have a process like interconnection that starts in customer, ends in customer, but touches every business unit across the enterprise in between. So getting all those stakeholders into the meeting to really look at the processes end to end, clarify the expectation of who's doing what, establishing those SLAs, and then we did side-by-sides with the employees to ensure that we were accounting for the type of work that they were doing, how their processes were going to be impacted, and making those changes before we fully launched. So June of 2016, we had everything dialed in, and we launched their newest version of the interconnection application portal that we use, and have had that since. So we oftentimes, when we're looking at how we're improving and making this as sustainable as possible, that questioning ourselves about why we do the things, right? There's a lot of conversations right now with regard to from the utility perspective, our goal is to provide safe, reliable power to our customers. And when you're interconnecting additional DER resources, there are things that the utility has to consider. But there's also times we have to take a step back from some of those decisions we made in the past, realizing the technology has changed and we have access to data, like through AMI meters, for instance, that we didn't before. So we don't make those decisions individually. We make those decisions as a whole. So if I have something that's going to impact the commercial side of the process, I'm reaching out to Katie and her team to go, hey, this is what we got. How are we going to do this? So having that connected end-to-end look at not only the redesign, but also the structure as we go is really important to making sure that we stay aligned in this approach. Because of this, we're not facing some of the challenges that some other folks in the market have, because we're 9-10 years into our design. So next slide, please. So this data has become extremely valuable. So SMUD over the last year took the all the historical PV data we have, brought it into one database, and any information that wasn't covered on the older applications and the older versions of our system is now being aligned and reset so we have good data, right? So there's a question with regard to how the shifts in the market impact the resources and the timing of the work. This is a reflection of the 2021 and 2022 applications received, where we received almost 3,000 more by the end of 3,000 to 4,000 more by the end of the year from what our historical average was. That was driven by SMUD's change in the net energy metering tariff and moving to a rate of compensation, which is 7.4 cents per kilowatt hour versus a retail credit. So the fluctuations in the market drive applications, but the workforce wasn't necessarily impacted because of the length of time it takes for those projects to be built. And a major portion of the market is residential new construction. So we're still seeing relatively similar numbers after that big bump that occurred during the rate change. But we keep an eye on it when it's happening. And going back to the point of how are we keeping this rolling and how are we keeping it aligned with the commitments we had before. So we get into situations where some of our teams don't make their SLAs, but we communicate with them with regard to what they're seeing, how we can help mitigate that, and what we can do to move things along, and communicating those things back to the customer and maintaining the expectation. Because like us, I'm sure you all are all resource constrained and you can't get more bodies. So you have to then look at the reality of the work that you can do and the time you have to do it. So we address the SLAs and we communicate with the customers if we're falling short. A good example of that, of something that occurs on a somewhat regular basis, is the folks that do the PV installation work also maintain some of our emergency services. So if we have major outages or storms, the PV work's going to stop, because we need to go restore our customers and take care of restoring service. So we then communicate during those times that this might be impacted. It may run a couple extra days. We just keep that communication open and then readdress the expectation when we need to. Next slide, please. So tell the right story. Okay. So this again is using that same set of PV data. So we're looking at the total days of our process and what it really takes. And this is not to call out any specific person, group, or individual. But the reality is, if you look at the process end to end, you count the days, the utility from SMUD's perspective isn't necessarily the one that is holding the ball, if you will, the longest. So this contractor installs dates that's listed here is the number of days that it's in their possession, but that includes everything where SMUD's not in review. That could be deficiency, revisions needed. We issue a permission to build, and then they go to the local jurisdiction, which is the city or counties within our service territory, to pull their permits. They have some automation in that space for their solar PV apps, but I know that process does take on a regular basis. Just speaking from my own experience, the county of Sacramento permitting process is 6 to 8 weeks to go through planning, approval, fire review, everything. So I believe they're putting in, yes, this would be accepted as a solar application, but they still have to go through that plan set review and do all those impacts. So I want to make sure we're not saying that the contractor is taking forever, because part of this timing is something that SMUD doesn't control and is also, in that jurisdictional space that may be causing the contractors additional time. However, this is also driven by new construction. As I mentioned, is about 80% of the applications we're getting. New construction developers put in their solar contractor will put in an entire subdivision and they'll sit there until those are starting to be built. So that's driving that timing as well. But end to end, realistically, a residential customer in SMUD service territory, about 90 days to 120 days. And commercial is about 6 months, but it just depends on how many revisions they have and all those things that kind of play into it. SMUD's goal from an SLA perspective is to not have hands-on a residential application more than 30 days total from end to end, from the day we receive an application, all the checkpoints along the way, set the meter, release permission to operate, set up in our operational systems, 30 days for residential, 60 days for commercial. I didn't publish it here, but we're right about 27, I think, for residential, and I think we're just over on commercial. But we made some changes with regard to some of our offerings that caused some of delays in that process. So telling the right story is going to be very important in this space when we're talking about timeliness to market. Next slide, please. Just want to give a high level look at what our process looks like. The residential is covered under the first two left slides. It splits right in the first column for residential and commercial. My team's initial review, we have 3 to 5 business days. We usually get our stuff done within the first day or within the next business day. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's approved in that time frame. Let me be absolutely clear that our expectations are SMUD will do this within these days. So if it's not right, we're going to send it back and revision reviews, and then now they're back on that clock where we're counting the contractor days. So each of these processes has a review, potential deficiency, revisions required, and then review again. So a lot of them that are cookie cutter get passed through relatively quickly, but there are those ones that fall out. So, and like we spend a lot of time on a very small portion of our projects, maintaining them and keeping them moving along. So residential swim lane goes through a technical review. Our battery goes through our distribution planning. So planning engineers look at all the battery installations, whether it's residential or commercial. A residential go through a workflow that we call, using a tool that SMUD created in partnership with NREL called Precise. That looks at the impacts of the transformer and upstream feeders as it relates to that installation. It makes those calculations, determines if there's settings required. We typically default to California Rule 21 settings, which is what most everybody's using now. So it makes it easier for the industry to not have to put in some custom thing for SMUD. And if Rule 21 settings don't make it, then we can call for custom settings, and we're looking at the volts and VARs and how it's interacting with our system. And we could call for those settings to be applied prior to releasing permission to operate. Assuming all that goes well, inspection comes in, metering team goes out, 7 to 10 business days, they set the meter and release the job for operation. Commercial goes through a longer timeline. There's more to look at. There's different impacts on the systems based on the size, where it's located. Commercial review, we try to get out the door, like I said, within 60 days, assuming it's, no major issues with the projects, we can usually meet that timeline. We do get into projects, anything over 500 kW, then telemetry starts coming into play. And that adds a whole nother layer with, telecom engineers have to come in. We have to look at what's available from a communications perspective. What if they don't have fiber? All kinds of different decisions and considerations have to be made when reviewing those projects. So that does add an additional layer. The important part is all of our interconnection guidelines and our service requirements that SMUD has reflects these timelines. So if you put all the information out there in a way that's logical and easy for them to find, they should have everything they need, assuming they do the research. So a lot of the phone calls that I get, we're not sending over to Katie and her team anymore. We're taking those pre-calls and go, here's all the FAQs, here's all the documentation. Please review these and ask us what questions you have specific to what SMUD's requirement are, we'll happy to meet with you and answer those questions. A lot of times we're, for lack of a better term, we're leading a horse to water to help them help themselves. Next slide, please. And this kind of goes into that commercial deliverables again. The small commercial and multifamily projects have a little bit of a less of a review, follow closer to the residential swim lane, and then the large commercial adds these additional layers as well that I was speaking to, and those do add time. Next slide. And speaking to the point that I was getting at with putting all the information out there in a way that's logical. So there's these are kind of the 4 main sites that SMUD has that point to our interconnection, but each of them, as you can see just by the visuals, have link after link after link. So if you're not a heavy user or you're a first-time user, you're going to maybe go to smud.org/solar and then head down the rabbit hole, if you will. So a lesson learned from my perspective is we maybe need to gather this up in a better manner. So what happens is these links sometimes get superseded, don't get updated, and we're contradicting ourselves within our own pages. So we're working with our marketing team to take all this information, put it into one easier to use page relative to commercial, relative to residential, same starting point, and then you find your path from there. And that also aligns with SMUD doing what is SMUD doing to SMUD's trying to improve its own website. They have several hundred pages within there that reflect a lot of information. Some of it's outdated. So we threw ourselves in front of that process and said, hey, marketing, we want to go first. So we're getting some traction there, and we're hoping that we can take all this information and kind of refine it into one. And next slide, please. And this is just kind of like high level. This is internal to SMUD. So this is what my team's working on most. And a lot of it's internal jargon and not really relative to what the industry sees. But the biggest point in this is what I've highlighted and bolded in the middle is those are again SMUD terms. So DES, which is our strategy, distribution strategy, R&D, CCS, which is customer, energy delivery, which then touches over on Katie's world, our continued focus on aligning our strategies and access to our existing processes rather than creating ad hoc processes. We're holding that line. Say, this is how we designed it. This is how we all agreed it's going to be done. Start here and build it out from there. And that's working. It's keeping us, it's avoiding us coming to the table with something that we're going to have to make a ton of exceptions to later. So aligning your strategies, top-down ownership of the process is going to really drive your success. And I think that's my last slide. Oh, no, sorry.
Ken, can I? Sorry, Ken. We have a question about what do we mean by the retrofit application?
Yeah, I'm going to get through this first.
Okay.
But thank you. So one of the other things that we're establishing starting next year is there's 2 halves of this process review. This is for the processes, meaning Katie's team, my team, the folks over in energy delivery, which that do all of our planning work. We kick off the process. We have a residential commercial one. We pull in all the stakeholders, identify who they are through this process. These reviews have shot clocks, because if we keep kicking the can down the road is when we keep getting out of alignment. And that's part of what we found is we weren't doing this annual process. So we're going to do it now. So we have our policy review happens the first 6 months of the year. And then the process review happens the last 6 months of the year. So we get all of our standards, interconnection guidelines, and everything reviewed in the first half, because there are times that we have to make changes on the back end to the process in order to make that happen. So that happens on the front end. process happens in the back end. And every year we're making sure that we're not necessarily going to be doing a rewrite or even doing anything, but at least we're putting it out there for the teams to make any changes on an annual basis that keeps us aligned, update our documentation, training, etc. And then there's no question about who should be doing what. And that's where we're at. So with regard to retrofit, retrofit is anything except new construction, essentially. So a customer that in an existing home, if I want to put solar on my house, I'm going to be considered a retrofit customer. Customer has existing solar, they're going to be adding onto it, retrofit. Unless it's a new construction build, it's considered a retrofit project. And let's see chat. What the retrofit application involves, is it metering, capacity changes? Okay, so it's SMUD, our tariff that for solar and storage rate is basically says solar is intended, it's single point, single meter, so you're connected behind the meter that the service is intended to, or that generation is intended to offset. It can only be up to 110% of the annual kilowatt hour requirement, or 120% if it's paired with battery. For new construction, we do 2 watts per square foot for mixed fuel properties and 3 watts per square foot of all electric. There's no real difference in the process itself. We do require production meters on systems that do not have battery. And they do look at system impacts, capacity changes, the other things that you've referenced, but the approval still is aligned with everything else. It has to be within this size requirement, period. If you're a retrofit customer, you have to already have a meter. So we're going to ask for the meter number. They provide that through the approval process. If they don't have it, we would consider them new. Hopefully that answered the question. Let's see. Their transmission level data is a distribution system, interconnection data available as well. I'll be interested in connecting with the research team working on that.
We'll take that. That's a question for Berkeley Lab. We'll take that
Sorry. Right.
during the live Q&A period, Ken. We could take the question from Fatima. What's the percentage of retrofits versus regular you saw in the last couple of years?
The market was pretty consistently a 60-40 split. And then after the rate change, it's about 80-20, meaning 80% new construction, 20% retrofit, 40. No, we do not use automation. And 40% retrofit, 60% new construction. And then like I said, after the rate change, it shifted to 80-20.
I'll take one more here. It's sort of a clarifying question. When reviewing residential PV only applications, does SMUD use automation or standardized fillable forms to increase likelihood that the applications meet the utility requirements?
No, we publish our requirements and rely on our contractors and electrical engineers and electricians to actually read them and build them as we have stated they should be. We refer back to our requirements rather than using automation for approvals.
Okay. All right. I think we'll hold the other questions until both presenters' presentations are done. Hanna and Derek, are you ready?
Yep, I'll just get the slide started here. All right. Great. So my name is Hanna Terwilliger, and I also have with me my colleague, Derek Duran. We both work for the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. And we're going to talk through Minnesota's work to revamp our interconnection process, and then kind of go through some of the results and some of the other things that start to impact interconnection timelines that are outside of the control of the interconnection process, that just have to do with things like large increasing amounts of DERs on the system. So Derek's going to start out, and then I'll go after that. But I will just note at the outset that any ideas expressed today are the views of us as presenters and not of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. And then I also just wanted to start out with a little bit of grounding on what Minnesota's distributed solar interconnections have looked like over the past 10 years. And so the vast majority are solar facilities. This is just showing the amount of interconnections that we've had every year by capacity. And so for large distributed solar, we did see a lot of growth in the late 2010s due to Xcel Energy's Community Solar Garden program. And that's kind of slowed down a bit, but changes in state policy have resulted in large amounts of new applications. And so while it's not in this graph here, we'll talk about it a bit later, but while there's 1.6 gigawatts of distributed solar on Minnesota's grid for the whole state, there's another 1.6 gigawatts of applications in the queue. And so I think that's a pretty substantial growth that could just double the amount of solar that we have within the next couple of years, when really this has taken over 10 years to get to the point we're at now. So that's going to present some new challenges as we move forward, but I think it's an exciting time to be working in the interconnection space. So I'll turn it over to Derek to go through what our interconnection procedures look like.
Great, and thanks, Hanna. As you mentioned, the CSG program, kind of a community solar program, was kind of what prompted the need to modernize our interconnection procedures. Historically, we worked from a set that was done in 2004. But as CSGs and the small DER option increased, like I said, it was kind of like we were forced to adapt a little bit. And in 2017, the Distributed Generation Working Group, the DGWG, was established to modernize those standards. And I'm going to go a little bit more into the work that was done there later, but eventually that group led to a commission order in 2019 and 2020 approving the modernized interconnection standards and process technical requirements. And those standards were broadly based off of the first FERC SGIP, the Small Generation Interconnection Procedures, and tailored towards Minnesota. And since then, the DGWG has been ordered to continue refining interconnection processes as the need arises. Next slide. Yeah, and I won't go through all of these, but this is just a kind of a glimpse at the amount of work and meticulous and methodical process of developing those new interconnection standards. So each month or each meeting, there was kind of a defined scope of what they were going to discuss as a group. And I'll get into the group makeup later, but the DGWG is made up of regulators, engineers from utilities, DER advocates, technical experts. It's kind of a mash of a bunch of groups together, all working towards making our interconnection process modernized and capable of handling interconnections going into the future. And yeah, this slide is just to kind of emphasize we worked hard and long on this and was very particular. Next slide. And to kind of get at some of the goals for today, the new process included a pre-application report. Customers now kind of have a longer list of requirements to fill out, so that when they do apply, it's more likely to be taken on its first time, rather than continually needing more information for the utility. The MinDip also created three study tracks, a simplified process, which is for projects 20 kilowatts and under, most of your residential and like farm, barn type systems, a fast track process, which is typically under 500 kilowatts, but can be used for larger systems under certain conditions. And then also we kind of just detailed what screens exactly do we need to go through, do these projects need to go through to interconnect. And this also included timelines, what a modification is for when something changes within the application period. It allowed we have application agents so they can work on behalf of the smaller customer. And then we have more information on fees and study deposits. It's a very thorough document, and we can provide links to it later. But these are kind of all the things that changed from that 2004 document to the now modern one. And then in addition to the MinDip, this is the technical interconnection interoperability requirements. This is at TIIR. And this was adopted officially in 2020, but the people who worked on creating these standards recognized that they wanted to kind of future-proof the interconnection process, and to do that, we had an interim implementation. And so it's specifically for the IEEE standards. And so for parts of the standards, we allowed utilities to meet the 2003 standards. And and part of that was because we wanted to make sure we weren't market choosers, or like we weren't, there was only a couple facilities that were creating, say, smart inverters or advanced inverters at that time, and we didn't want them to have kind of a monopoly on what was available. And so part of that was waiting until there's market proliferation for some of this tech. Yeah, and this included utility specific technical specification manuals, which is we have a wide range of utilities, and so this is just to kind of tailor it to those specifically. Also needs to be agreed to by the commission. We have to approve it. And when this was created, there were still some remaining issues, as I indicated, about how to handle energy storage control modes, power control systems. And then we have listed here volt var regulation, volt watt regulation. The volt var and volt watt, as I'll get into later, has been addressed since this was created, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Next slide. To do an overview of our process tracks, we have this diagram here. So simplified, that's going to be all those projects under 20 kilowatts. We wanted this to be as simple as the name implies, and easy to do. And there's 9 to 11 steps depending on whether or not the customer submitted all the right data, and whether or not they needed a supplemental review. And that typically takes 83 to 93 maximum business days. That's what's allowed by the MINDIP. We'll get into what those timelines look like later, but it's typically not the maximum. It's a little bit lower than that. And 30 to 40 days of that is not on the utility, it's on the customer side as they kind of agree to certain conditions. Fast track, like I said, it's up to 500 kilowatt typically, but can be used for larger projects as well. And this is going to include like your small businesses, corporations that have a setup that's not huge, but not small either. We have a little bit more steps here, and a little bit more longer period as the studies kind of become more complex to work through. And then lastly, we have our study track, which is typically what we've been seeing. So historically, the community solar gardens have been 1 megawatt. Now they're allowed to be 5 megawatts, but almost all of those projects typically go through the study process. And this includes a system impact study, which has a lot more engineering screens they have to go through. And this is a little bit longer as well and can take up to 170 days or so if facilities studies are required and if a transmission study is required. And I'll note here that this does not include projects that are on hold. As you saw in that first graphic, we had a huge like applications for DERs early on, and we absorbed a lot of that, but that kind of took over most of the available capacity in the areas where the demand was the most. And now when a larger application goes through, they're studied one by one, and so when they're not being studied, they're put on hold. And so that's just to kind of emphasize that. Next slide. And here's just a graphic of your typical application. You have the application. Utility sees if it's a full application or not. If it's not, they send it back and asking them to fill it out more completely. And then we get into the engineering review screens and studies. And eventually it gets approved. There's an agreement. And at the last step, we have witness tests typically, where the utility goes out there, make sure all the specifications are up to date and correct. This has been more important as we have started using advanced inverters, just to kind of make sure everything is correctly placed. Next step. So to get back to the DGWG, we try to have a comprehensive and representative a representation of the DG space in Minnesota. And so that included utilities, cooperatives, municipals, small and large DG industry, as well as renewable and technical advocates like EPRI and IREC. we wanted to create a space that included all of the voices essentially. And we did have to have kind of a cutoff because there are several groups, but we think we got most of the relevant players in our state. And we did have an emphasis on technical expertise. A lot of the issues that we are seeing today are about technical issues. And so we have engineers as the primary representative. Sometimes when we have more policy calls, lawyers and policy analysts will be involved as well. But typically it's been technical. And it's evolved over time. Some developers were really interested in the beginning on the creation of the MinDip, and less so now. But now we have new players that are active in the space and want to be involved. And we've kind of evolved the groups as we've progressed. Next slide. And so the purpose of the DGWG, originally it was to create the MinDip and TIIR, but now it is also to respond to interconnection issues today, any opportunities, a changing landscape. Sometimes parties will petition the commission directly and have a topic that will be ordered to be covered by the group. And what I want to emphasize here too is that this is specifically a space that we can explore these topics more thoroughly and efficiently. And it's not a rigid formal process where it's like every week you can send comments to kind of comment on each other's positions or theories. It's a space to really cut through all of that and make sure we can get a full understanding earlier and faster. And this ultimately leads for consensus items. The DGWG will make recommendations to the commission, and if it was done thoroughly and there's consensus, it's a pretty quick transition. Commission will typically vote yes on that. For more complex topics, the goal is to find consensus where it exists, and then clearly identify the differences of the opinions. And by doing this, when we do get to that formal record period, we can really focus in on the differences rather than all of the potential topics, and that makes the decision making less complex and also more thorough as well. Norms, we've placed a very strong emphasis on civility, honesty, and clear communication. Sometimes the parties are really at odds, and that can be tough to navigate, but we find that it's very important to kind of make sure that this space is a space to have those conversations more candidly. And we also ask that parties become prepared and willing to participate. We really don't want parties coming in with preconceived ideas that are not current or modern. And so we really want them to be kind of involved in the conversation. And also the discussions within the group are not part of a formal record. The reports can be, but the discussions are not. And so that just kind of creates a better space to communicate. And what's often the case is we'll create subgroups as well. And sometimes a technical subgroup will be created for more complex and technical items, but this is just it's identified topic within the group, and then specific people that are interested in it can meet outside of the group and work together, and then present to the DGWG as a whole. And that allows kind of some parallel working when topics come up. And some examples of the subgroups have been to facilitate the implementation of advanced inverters, the IEEE 2018 inverters, unintentional islanding screens, and topics like that. So some of the outputs and successes of the group. So obviously the MinDip and TIR have been a pretty good success. We've continued to modify the MinDip and TIR as needed. But there's been other reports that came out of it that led to better processing in the interconnection. And that includes parallel processing. This is essentially as a larger project is being studied, a smaller DER, a 40 kilowatt and under DER can be studied in parallel rather than sequentially. And that's really helped with the smaller DER adoption. Semi-parallel processing. So when those larger DERs are being studied, once they finish the system impact study and are onto the facilitation phase, the next large DER in the queue can be studied then rather than waiting until the entire process is done. We also implemented a small DER cost sharing fund. This is specifically from Excel. And for this, every 40 kilowatt and under project pays $200 currently into a fund that is able to be accessed by any small DER customer that triggers a secondary system upgrade. There's like those small transformers, things like that, which can typically be $5,000–7,000. And this fund is used to kind of facilitate that so that that cost isn't directly tied to that one customer. It's a way to kind of share those costs a little bit. Additionally, we have cluster studies, 3 to 8 larger DER studied in a group and collectively paying for the upgrades. This has been kind of had mixed success, but as we get on later, Hanna and I are currently working on another process that kind of supersedes the cluster studies, but that is an interim process that we are using. And then other successes, we transitioned to the IEEE, as I mentioned earlier, 1547 2018 advanced inverters. And what the DGWG was discussing was what specific specifications are going to be used in Minnesota. And so that included volt-var, volt-watt, and also included working with national groups to kind of know when and where market proliferation for those inverters were readily available. That was the language we used. And as of January 1, 2024, we are now requiring these advanced inverters. Other successes, unintentional islanding, we have new screens for that. And some ongoing stuff that we are currently working on is how to process small-scale storage and non-export systems, flexible interconnection, and then also studies that of DER studies that impact transmission system level equipment. That's all being worked on currently. So some basic takeaways. You have to identify a well-balanced work group or informal group of individuals from the DER industry, utilities, regulators. Just create a group that includes everyone, or at least representations of each kind of interest group. Have a clear process, scope, and time frame. Really encourage shared learning and include the commission in that process. This just level setting is really key, and emphasizing that is pretty important. And then also keep in mind future proofing. So that includes something like with the interim implementation of the TIIR. That was kind of us like realizing that in the future we want to do this, but we're not there yet. But identifying that route beforehand can be important. And then engaging outside experts in a transparent way. We often have education sessions in the DGWG where we bring in experts to kind of level set for the whole group. And then also, delineate where there's technical versus policy considerations, because the difference there is pretty key. And I believe that might be it. Next slide. Yep.
All right, great. So I'm going to go over what the data and the results of our interconnection process are telling us, and then kind of how we're moving forward with the next steps to improve DER interconnections beyond just process reform. And I want to note that with the data that you're going to see, this is only for the 4 regulated utilities who are required to report to the PUC. It does include our largest utility, Xcel Energy, which is the majority of interconnections and capacity. And then also we do use median business days. And so overall, it's the trends that are important, but we do use the median instead of the average due to some of those outliers that we see because of the distribution system congestion that I'll talk about in a minute. So to start, the number of annual applications that we're seeing under MNDIP has steadily gone up since it was implemented in 2019. Slight drop in 2023. You'll see that the kind of interconnections lag by about a year, the number of applications that are coming in, but the vast majority of the applications we're getting are under the simplified process. So those smaller systems, 20 kilowatts and under, which are primarily going to be, your residential, small commercial systems. And so I think what the really good news is even though we've seen increasing number of applications, the time to interconnect has decreased. And so that's decreased across all process tracks and all utilities, which is what this graph is showing. And that includes the entire timeline, which has responsibilities on both the interconnection customer and the utility. And so the biggest decline has been under that simplified process, and that's a 58% decrease in the number of business days that it takes a customer to interconnect. So I think that's a really big success, and we know that the process is working, even if there might be some other areas that still have issues to work out. And so we can dive in a little more onto how the different steps in the process contribute to the overall timeline for small solar interconnections. And so this is looking at just, again, that simplified process, so less than 20 kilowatts. And this is a comparison across the regulated utilities. And you can see that the longest step in the timeline is after the customer signs their interconnection agreement and when permission to operate is granted. So that's the time when construction is occurring, you're doing your witness testing, your meter install. So a lot of responsibilities on both the customer and the utility during that time. But then in the initial portions of the process, things like completeness review, the initial engineering review, utilities are exceeding the timelines that they're allotted under MnDOT, which was not really the case in earlier, or not MnDOT, MnDIP, which was not the case in earlier years. When the process first started out, we did see many of the applications exceeding their timelines, but that's improved as our utilities have gotten a lot more familiarity with the process. They've gotten better at setting their system up. Of course, there's still going to be some that are outside, but the majority are falling under those timelines, which I think is great news for customers. And I want to take a minute to note here that we're able to track this information really closely because we set up the detailed reporting at the outset of the interconnection update. The reporting was a part of that update, and this made it easier for our utilities to build the reporting into their systems so they could pull automatic reports and make sure that there was a common understanding of how the timelines were being tracked. The first report that we got in for the 2019, we had to go back and do a little bit of refinement because not every utility was tracking things from the exact same point in time. But since 2019, we went back and redid that right away. And now we've seen really accurate, good reporting from our utilities going forward. So shifting to look at the capacity of interconnections under MnDIP, you can really see this is a different story, that the vast majority of capacity that's coming online is from large projects. And even that has dramatically increased in the past year due to the passage of new legislation around DERs in Minnesota. And so this means that even though we see the interconnection process is working well at high volumes of applications, as you'll see, there are other factors that can slow down the interconnection. And so these next few slides will focus on Xcel Energy, which is experiencing a lot of these constraints due to the high volume and capacity of applications that they're seeing on their system. So you can start to see the issue when you break down how long it takes those larger applications to go through the study process. Well, we're seeing a large amount interconnected in 4 to 14 months. There's a significant volume of applications that are taking longer than 2 years to complete interconnection. And obviously that is a very long time for any project. And the study process, while it is largely big systems, there are in these, what we'll talk about in a minute, capacity constrained areas, small rooftop systems that get cut up in this as well. So someone trying to put a 5 kilowatt system on the roof who can't do so due to other constraints on the system. So this is the issue, distribution system congestion. The interconnection process can only go so far. While you can reduce the timeline in that process, once the distribution system reaches capacity at its current equipment levels, those connection times are going to skyrocket. And that's exactly what we're seeing happening in Minnesota. We've had extremely successful programs, and that's really amazing. But it has resulted in portions of Xcel's distribution grid having little to no remaining capacity to interconnect additional solar. And so while you can do things like non-wires alternatives, like flexible interconnection that could free up some limited additional capacity, the expected volume of DERs and electrification that we're expecting to see in Minnesota is significant enough that starting to upgrade distribution equipment like transformers, not just at the service level, but up to that feeder and substation level, is becoming necessary. And so I think this is what's, you can see this problem is only growing, and it's primarily due to large front of the meter interconnection applications, and they are going to areas that are already constrained and have been constrained for multiple years. The previous image was from Xcel Energy's hosting capacity map, so people are able to see where these constraints exist. There is a published list of constrained substations and feeders that is updated every single month. And because these are front-of-the-meter projects, they do have more freedom to choose where they interconnect, but that is, of course, limited by external factors like land availability, the cost to interconnect, local permitting, that complicate this picture. So instead of citing where the load is, they are drawn to more rural areas where the land is more plentiful. You're not having to try and do more complex installations over parking lots or on rooftops, but there's less load to absorb those interconnections, which is why you're seeing these really lengthy study timelines. And in some cases, as Derek mentioned, starting to require transmission impact studies up at the regional grid level. And so over the past year, 76% of all capacity for Xcel's system has applied in areas that are constrained and have known to be constrained for many years. So I think that that's just a signal that it's not the process that's not working, there's other factors at hand. And it's not going to stop here. This is from Xcel Energy's integrated distribution plan, where they're forecasting 5.4 gigawatts of distributed solar and $992 million in upgrades by 2052 to accommodate the state's policy changes, including an updated community solar garden program and a distributed solar energy standard that is 3% of retail sales by 2030. And then, of course, just customers, residential, small commercial, large commercial customers who are wanting to interconnect solar. That also adds to the amount that's expected to be seen coming on the system. And so once you start to see these types of issues, distribution planning really is a key tool in addressing how to prevent these bottlenecks before they happen. And so in Minnesota, we've had distribution system planning since 2018. And these are the objectives that we have that are meant to kind of proactively plan to address these types of concerns. And so this is a way that utilities can start looking at the solutions in a way that includes their stakeholders and regulators in creating this plan rather than waiting until things are set in stone. And it's much more difficult to incorporate feedback from folks who are going to be interconnecting to the grid or reliant on it for other ways. And so what this has led to in the past year or two is the discussion on how to think about upgrading the distribution grid, including how to allocate those costs to alleviate and prevent a congested distribution system that hinders DER adoption. And so the framework that is on screen here was done by one of our stakeholders in Xcel Energy's distribution plan in 2023. And it really kind of looks at how proactive and reactive upgrades, along with shared and individually allocated costs, are impacting both utility ratepayers and DER customers. And so what I want to highlight here is more, again, on this timeline side of things, is that proactive upgrades are how utilities, regulators, DER providers can think about eliminating those wait times that exist under the current reactive process, where you are waiting to upgrade the grid until you've got a problem. And of course, with both models, you're going to have a lot of other important factors to consider, especially things like protecting ratepayers from increased costs, not having stranded distribution investments. But that is this is a really important tool to take that next step once you've got your process figured out into how you can reduce those timelines. And so, as mentioned, Minnesota is tackling both proactive and reactive frameworks to help shorten some of those lengthy timelines that are continuing to grow across Xcel Energy's service territory. And so the reactive process will help in addressing that existing congestion, so kind of clearing it out, while the proactive framework is going to seek to prevent future delays and congestion by forecasting where the DER growth is expected to occur and making those upgrades before there's specific customer interest, so they aren't having to wait. As I think many of you likely know, it can take 2 to 5 years to do a significant distribution system upgrade. And if you are a small solar rooftop customer, that just feels like a really long time to wait. Both Derek and I help our consumer affairs team with complaints, and we get numerous complaints every year about, well, why is it going to take 2 years for me to interconnect? Why is it going to take, in some cases, 30 years for me to interconnect before they might get through my application process? And so that's just really frustrating, especially to smaller customers. And so looking at these solutions is going to help increase their ability to interconnect to the grid. And both these processes are underway. We're doing a work group process similar to, I think, what was described with how we updated our interconnection standards. And it'll be really exciting to track the results and see if that addresses the timeline issues that are outside the control of the process itself. So with that, thank you very much for having us. And we are happy to answer any questions and share any other details about Minnesota's work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have a lot of questions, and we have some questions for SMUD also, but I'm going to start with questions for you, Hanna and Derek. We have quite a few. Let's start with a really interesting one. A couple of years ago in Minnesota, even after the rule streamlining, there were still problems with utility interconnection delays, with the PUC raising a threat of $1 million fine on the utility. How was that resolved, and what is the current status?
Yeah, so oh, go ahead.
Do you want to speak to this one?
Sure. In that period of like 2019, 2022, about we were really kind of having a lot of issues around that specifically. And we still had that $1 million fee, and it was tripped for interconnection-based issues at one time. And one of the biggest things that we did that kind of helped that process was the implementation of parallel processing in unconstrained areas, which allowed small DER projects to be studied in parallel with the larger ones. Prior to that, it was done all sequentially. It was just chronologically, they'd be studied one by one. And that might be necessary for the constrained areas, but in the unconstrained areas where there is enough space for small DER to be interconnect, we directed Excel to kind of stop doing that, to study them in parallel. And over the last couple of years too, Excel has been able to kind of really understand the rules of the game and kind of streamline themselves as well. And so that's been helpful too, just as everyone in the industry kind of learns the new rules that were created. There are still some issues, some kinks to kind of work out, but just that going to parallel processing and non-sequentially processing kind of did resolve many of the issues. But so that's what I have to say there.
All right, let me
Yeah,
go ahead, Hanna.
Oh, I'll just add, so the $1 million fine was actually a result of Excel's quality of service plan, and that was just triggered by complaints in general. So it wasn't a fine that was specific to interconnection, but there was the interconnection complaints that ended up tipping it over that threshold.
Great, thanks for the clarification. Sort of a follow-up question. Derek, you mentioned the cluster processes had mixed success and you're working on an enhanced process. What were some of the drivers behind the mixed success, and what types of enhanced processes are you looking at?
Right, so it's been mixed success. The success has been they have been studying them more efficiently and quickly, them being Excel. However, it's mixed success too, in that on the one hand, it's kind of tough for the developers to kind of work amongst themselves and make sure they plan everything and coordinate together. That's one issue, but the biggest issue is still kind of the big issue of upgrades costing a lot of money to pay for. And still having the cost causer pays model, where one developer, and in this case, a group of developers pay together, and they end up creating more capacity than their projects need, and they don't have any rights to that freed up capacity. And what we're doing now instead is what Hanna indicated at the end, at least with the reactive cost sharing model. We're still working out the exact details. It's similar to the cost sharing 2.0 model in New York, but it's going to be where one project will trigger a need for an upgrade, say it's $2 million, and will create 10 megawatts. You can have 10 projects indicate that they are willing to pay for pay for the amount of watts that their projects need. And that effectively shares it amongst themselves and also gets rid of that excess issue, because say we meet a threshold, the upgrade is created and there's still 2 megawatts available. Subsequent interconnecting customers will interconnect and pay for that 2 watt, the pro rata share of that. And so we believe that this cost sharing model, because it is a market driven, upgrades will only happen if there's demand for it. We think that this will be an easier way compared to the cluster study, which is it was still kind of an ad hoc pilot-ish kind of thing, but we believe this new process will work a little bit better.
All right, I'm not sure if that makes this next question moot, but it's a good one. For cluster studies, how do you handle scenarios where one or more projects drop out of the generation queue in the interconnection?
Yes, that was a big area of contention. And I believe the current process is like the penalty for dropping out is that that developer is no longer able to apply for interconnection on that substation. I believe maybe it's feeder, but for an entire year. And so there's like if you drop out when everyone was ready to go, you're no longer it's more than just a slap on the wrist. It's like you kind of lose rights to interconnect in that area for a year. But like you said, we hope this new process will kind of make that situation moot.
Great. What's being done at the commission level to plan for increased capacity needs resulting from growth in interconnections at the distribution level? Or is this largely left to utilities to address?
Yeah, this is, I think, where the proactive process comes in, and I'll be a little careful because we are under an open comment period here. So I'll just talk more in general about what proactive upgrades are meant to do. And that is to say, like, we do have these forecasts. I showed Excel's last forecast in the slides. We know that there is going to be more coming online. And so how can we start to more granularly predict where that is going to be and have more certainty about how can we have some certainty and how can we tolerate that risk to do these upgrades ahead of time in conjunction with other things like age-related replacements. Oh, sounds like my audio isn't working.
We could hear you, but it's you've got static. So you might want to put yourself on mute and then we'll figure it out. Maybe if nothing else, you could call in.
I'll try calling in.
Oh,
I think it sounds good now.
Oh, okay. So it got fixed by whatever it was.
The threat
yes.
of it.
Yep.
Okay.
So I will, just to recap, this is where the proactive upgrade process is coming in. So I think that's where we as regulators have, or the commission has decided that, yes, let's look at doing a proactive process because there are a lot of efficiencies that you can gain when you are not just doing things on an ad hoc basis, but you are trying to plan for where do we anticipate this coming. And so Xcel Energy has started to do more spatial and granular forecasting of both DERs and load to know where that's going to come on. And so this process is looking at how do we balance risk? How do we look at protecting ratepayers in order to do that? So we are cutting down on wait times, but also coordinating it with things like age-related replacements or other reliability upgrades that are part of the utilities, I would say more traditional business process, so we can recognize those efficiencies and overall reduce costs for everybody in the long run.
Great. Catherine, we do have someone with their hand raised.
I am, let's see, attempting. It is not letting me unmute.
Okay, well, you can work that out with Kristen and I'll go through. We have more questions. Okay, let's go back to some questions for SMUD. We still have Katie and Ken. There was a question about the percentage of retrofits versus other kinds of interconnections that you've seen in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I touched on that in the presentation. Prior to the going away from the NEM retail compensation, it was about a 60-40 split of new construction to retrofits. And since then, we moved our rate change March 1st of 2022, and since then it's flipped slightly, or more than slightly, and it's 80% new construction, 20% retrofit.
Okay, great. Also, we have a question. What are you finding, Ken, to be the best approach to preventing and eliminating backfeed into the transmission system?
We'd have to talk to our systems folks with regard to that, but we do have, I mentioned we have AIF settings, so we are looking at situations with impacted feeders. A good example of that is, California requires, all new construction to have at least a solar element. Now they're moving to, a solar plus battery and, different things. So, from a code compliance perspective, we've seen issues more so on the residential side where you're impacting our 12 kV distribution system, which feeds most of our new construction residential. We do have some on 21, but mostly 12, where we're requiring them to use PCS, power control systems, to limit export to a determined value. So, and those are really handled on a case-by-case basis. There is the alternative for them to, to upgrade the feeder, which then usually that's the end of that conversation. But, if a customer or a developer wants to pay to upgrade our system and pay for it, let's go. So, all day long. But generally that's not the case. And we do allow, PCS to be used. It's part of it's on the current version of NEC from a code perspective, and there's a lot of benefits to doing that because it also gets outside of the main breaker upsizing requirement as well by doing that. So that's how we do it.
Great. Question back for Hanna and Derek. Your slide showed that behind the meter additions, we're going to overtake the front of the meter additions in terms of megawatts in the next 20 years. What do you think is the reason?
I can speak at least to the first spike that you're seeing in kind of that 25 to 2030, and that is due to compliance with the new distributed solar energy standard that passed in 2023. Beyond that, I would have to go and look more at the utilities methodology. We tend to focus a little bit more on that kind of 5 to 10 year horizon because once you get past that, things are a bit more uncertain. So a lot of the forecasting they're using, Excel is using a tool called LoadSeer. And so that's using a lot of other market-driven data, not necessarily, it's got pieces that are tailored to their service territory. But I would say that I wouldn't have any speculation as to why that would be increasing other than just, I think, why you would expect to see technology adoption increase just in general, lower cost, easier processes and everything else, but no specific policy drivers on the horizon that would target that increase in the, I would say in the 2040s.
Okay.
Lisa?
Go ahead.
Excuse me. I want to add one more point that I missed because that question was specifically to how we're controlling it to backfeeding on the transmission. So, part of Katie's role in this is we do have separate interconnection agreements for projects that require telemetry. So whatever system control function we would need, whether it's protection, transfer trip, whatever it may be, is written within that term in those operational agreements of those interconnection projects.
Great. Thanks for the clarification.
Sure.
All right, back to Minnesota. Would unintentional islanding be evaluated strictly by screens, or would EMT studies be performed upon screen failure? And I guess, that could be a question for SMUD as well.
I can answer that. So we created screens, but it was prompted from Excel using voltage supervisory reclosing, like VSR, as their kind of primary upgrade to handle the risk of unintentional islanding. And what prompted more discussion on that was that's kind of a pretty costly upgrade. And so we were exploring what we can do that didn't involve installing VSR. And we ended up creating 3 new screens for unintentional islanding, and I'll post them in the chat right now. But as of right now, those screens are kind of or what's used to kind of indicate whether or not it'll be an issue, and that kind of helps maybe reduce the amount of VSR implementation. However, that group is still ongoing. They got through the screens and they were just kind of weren't there yet on alternative technology, alternative upgrades to kind of handle unintentional islanding. And so they're kind of as ongoing discussing it amongst themselves, the
Right.
subgroups.
And any comments from you? And this is just about screens. Are screens handling the back feeder? Do you need to?
Yeah,
do
we'd have to, again, that's more of an operator's call. We have to circle back with planning if we want to get an answer on that.
All right, good enough.
Mhm.
Couple more questions, and then we have a whole bunch of questions at Berkeley Lab to ask. So this is for Minnesota, when a developer applies in a constrained area, presumably they get an impact study back with the upgrade costs, and at that point they decide whether they want to pay, and go forward. Do you know what percentage of projects or capacity ends up moving forward, and versus how much withdraws?
I can take that one, Derek, to start. So I don't have the number off the top of my head, but we would be able to look it up in our data. They do get it's called the system impact study, and then there's a facility study, and that does indicate the cost. What we've seen is somewhere between, depending on the size of the facility, we will see people pay, up to $500,000 for upgrades without withdrawing. It's kind of when you start to get into that greater than that amount that you're starting to see people withdraw. I think the biggest issue comes in when the next person in queue is a 5 kilowatt system and they're being told you need to pay $1 million to upgrade the substation, and they go, no, thank you. And then we tend to get a complaint that says, why am I in a red zone? So that's, again, I think what thinking about these cost sharing options is meant to solve, because it is really difficult when you've got a residential customer who can't interconnect, and it's not like they can move and go somewhere else just so they can interconnect their solar.
Right.
And Derek,
Any comments from Sled?
I have a little bit to add, if that's all right. So they do get that estimate from the system impact study, and they can kind of choose to go forward or not. However, we found that the vast majority who started the facilities studies process did go forward. And that's when I talked about one of the successes earlier, the semi-parallel processing was implemented. And that essentially just means as a larger project goes to facility studies, the next one in the queue we can start study there. And we chose that because we saw that the vast majority did continue on after that step. And so, like I said, and as with Hanna, I don't have the exact numbers, but it was convincing enough to kind of allow that streamlining of the study process.
And in some years, I can say we've had a huge percent of solar withdrawal, right? When the program first opened back in 2015, so this was before we updated the interconnection standards, there was over 2 gigawatts of applications. And I believe somewhere between 50 and 75% of those dropped out. And so what we'll see a lot of times happen is there will be at one of our most congested substations, the Chisago substation, for example, right? There's a huge line of 1 megawatt projects, and one will get studied, it'll get the costs, it'll drop out. The next one will get studied, so you kind of just see this. It's not like one of them is suddenly making it through, but they're all just kind of sitting there waiting, hoping maybe somebody in front of me will pay for it, and then I will get to interconnect as well. But again, I think that's where this cost sharing will really come in and help, because one piece I think that Derek touched on earlier is with the cluster studies, the issue is that there's like a process to do the study, but there's not a formalized process set up then to try and do that cost sharing. And so that's where it gets really hard to coordinate against different large entities, how you're going to pay for it, who's going to pay for what, whose responsibility different things are. And so that's where I think the cluster study process just got a little bit tricky. And like, if you pull out, is there any penalty or anything else, right? All of that's pretty nebulous and not defined. And so making that into an actual formalized process is what's going to help alleviate that concern.
Ken, do you have any comments you want to make?
No, I don't think so. I don't deal with that space a whole lot. I don't know if Katie has anything there, from a, like, where are we in the process when you're looking at new construction, subdivisions and things like that? Obviously, we're we're designing from my understanding, we've been told we're designing our system based on, they know there's going to be DERs, solar, such interconnected. So we don't necessarily have the room on the feeders because there's not as much load in that instance, is how it's being interpreted. So the local agencies, the cities and counties, require us to look at their full subdivision submittal first and we have to issue called an approval to build letter that goes to them, and then they can pull their permits. Or it may be stuck in planning pending us receiving that letter. So we look at the full plan set, entire layout. It shows all of the elevations and site plans for each of the builds. And then we go, yes, this will work. Here's the stipulations, if there are any, say non-export. You have to use, install PCS, and it has to limit the export to 5 kW, for instance. So we put that in the general statement for the whole subdivision. And then we say on the tail end of this, when you get to the point, you need to put an interconnection application for each lot, each address, because each one is in and of itself its own interconnection point behind its own meter. So that's how we do that. So they're very well aware that when you build this is what we're going to ask for. Then when it comes down to application time, we're not throwing out a surprise going, oh, by the way, that 7.5 kW, we're only gonna let you have 5. So that's how we try to be transparent, at least in that commercial smaller development, residential space.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask one more question from the audience at this time, and then we've got some questions that we wanted to ask you. This is a good one. Will the increase in electric vehicle interconnections resolve or complicate the grid congestion challenges from solar interconnections? Who wants to have their crystal ball read?
I would love to talk about this. This is what I spend much of my time thinking about. So I think there's kind of two answers to this, right? There's one at like the bulk power system level and your kind of total system energy needs. Is that like your total energy needs, you are going to see some of that increased electrification offset some of your increased generation from solar. The more complicated answer is it really depends on where everything is, right? So the problem that we have in Minnesota is the solar is going out into areas that are lower population density. And so they're not going to see as high amounts of electrification as Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is the largest urban area is. The other issue is timing. Right now, the cheapest electricity in Minnesota is at night when the wind is blowing, right? So we are encouraging people to charge their electric vehicles at night, which is great because that's when they're parked at home in their garage. Now, solar production is going to coincide during the day. So then you're starting to think about, okay, well, now we want to tell people to charge their vehicle during the day while they're at work. And so now they're at work in downtown Minneapolis. And again, that's not where the solar is at. So you start to get these local congestion issues. So overall, my answer would be, I don't think at the distribution level, you are going to see as much benefit from doing that without a lot of projects and really intentional program design to alleviate it. It's not something that's just going to happen organically. You're going to have to really think about it through the distribution planning process, through how you're designing your charging tariffs and everything else. And again, it might turn out that in somewhere like Minnesota, because we have so much wind, overnight is still the best time for the system to charge your vehicles on the bulk power system level. And so then you start to think about like, what is the difference between what's best for the bulk power system and what's best for the distribution system? And so I think it gets complicated really quickly. But I think that at the kind of technology integration levels we're seeing right now, my answer would be no, but I think we could get there. So it's a great area to have more research and look forward to in the future.
Great. Ken, how about for SMUD service area?
So fortunate for me, so EV doesn't actually hang out in the interconnection space because, if a customer wants to do vehicle to home and use their EV and take that into a critical path, they're welcome to do that. But we're looking at really, SMUD's looking at the inverter, right? So You touched on, I think yours is 1741 SA, ours is SB, and then everything else is the same. So we use the CEC drop downs for applications. And if the the vehicle is in the position on a DC coupled inverter, it's just a battery at that point. So, but we do have an EV rate and incentive. So if you do register, you have a EV circuit in your home, you provide your vehicle registration that shows that matches your address. Then we do a discounted charging rate during our off-peak hours and provide that schedule. So we do that to maintain it. But there is a piece where we're looking into, especially in the commercial space, where they're looking at transformer impact studies by adding EV and how that additional load is impacting the feeder. But again, that falls under, it's outside of the interconnection process because SMUD's Rule 21 is at the customer expense, and adding EV and additional load is similar to upgrading a facility, save customers putting a 400 amp panel into a home that had a 200 amp panel. So falls more in that space where SMUD looks at it.
Great. All right, Catherine, why don't we go to some of our questions?
Sounds great. Thanks. All right. So this is a question to all panelists. What is the most effective mechanism you've used to expedite interconnection timelines? You've all discussed some different mechanisms, but here's your chance to talk about one of your favorites. Hanna, Derek, do you want to jump in first?
Derek, go for it.
Sure. Yeah. It's a simple one and is kind of correcting an issue that maybe shouldn't have been there, but the parallel processing, I think, had the biggest impact, at least for small DERs, to be interconnected quicker. Since before that, it was sequentially. And that's what, like, if you remember a couple years, like 5 years ago, there were headlines of like, it takes 20 years to interconnect. It's because they were doing it, Excel specifically was studying these projects sequentially, and having them go parallel processing, I think really helped a lot. And we also ordered them to get rid of the on-hold practice in all of the areas where it wasn't super capacity constrained. And I think that helped a lot. The issues in the capacity constrained areas is still kind of an ongoing issue, and the reactive and proactive process is kind of the big solution to that as we see it.
I'll just maybe add in, I think that just redoing the interconnection process in general was a huge step forward. I know that's really basic, but there's a lot of states that I think probably haven't done that yet. And that is such an easy first step to clarify, having things like an online queue, a formalized system that the utility is using to track everything. All of those just kind of little process improvements are no regrets solutions that I think anybody can do. And it really just saves everybody time and money.
That's super helpful. Thank you. Ken, do you want to jump in?
So I would think that kind of jump on Hannah's point there, doing what we did in that 2015 through 17-ish era of redesigning our process from a program to it being operational, right? That's where Katie's role came into play, right? We didn't have an interconnection PM before. We had a supervisor that ran the residential side and a supervisor that ran the commercial side, and that caused things to fall off the table. The whole point of it was get a dedicated resource to handle these high-level projects, starting at our commercial customers all the way up to our largest. So there's a single point of contact from beginning to end. Clear processes, clear definition of what your expectations are, including your electric. So we have electric service requirements that says this is how we expect you to interconnect your facilities to SMUD from a distribution equipment perspective. Your panel needs to look like this with these meters, no ringless sockets, all that good stuff, right? We have those service requirements, and then we tagged on a distribution interconnection requirement. So we have a DG specific requirement for commercial and residential. So when you're interconnecting solar, it needs to look like this. You have to have a production meter here. You have to have a disconnect here, so on and so forth. Clear annual review, stay aligned. And then handling the one-offs and not necessarily taking them in, but aligning them with what the processes are. So clear process with borders and guardrails that you keep in place, and you don't step across, because that's when you start going, well, I did it last time this way. I did it last time this way. So that's a huge result. And alignment across the board from the start to the end of the process has been huge. And then once we got that, it's all process mapped and everyone's cool. We have something tangible to work with. Then we looked into the systems. So, we take our interconnection application vendor, we take our enterprise system that we use for CRM and other things, it's SAP, and we start creating API calls from beginning to end. So when my team hits the button, it creates the notification, it pulls everything off the application, it pulls everything out of SAP, and it lands over to the next team, whether it be Katie or the other design team. So that's helped. Clear communication. The customer should always know what's going on with their project, right? The utility is in this kind of interesting space where we're serving our customer, the contractor serving the same customer. We both have our own agendas and priorities. So keeping the story of who is doing what when has been huge. So we require the customer to be on the application along with the installer, contractor, etc., along with email, etc. Every step of the way, there's an email. My team, we receive an application, customer gets an email saying we received your application. We approve it, customer gets an email saying approve it, so on and so forth. It's deficient, they get that. So clear understanding of where it's at to avoid the confusion. So, and then pointing to the reason why we're saying your contractor can't do this, or or whether we're talking to the customer or to the contractor, is we pointed out in the guidelines. It's right here. You need that we give this to you so we don't have to have these conversations. So, and then coach or lead them to the right answer for the next time, and then hopefully it's smoother. And then you get your frequent flyers that no matter how many times you talk to them, they're still going to do it the same way. What did I miss, Katie? Anything?
So for the commercial side, we're Sacramento County. That's how big we are. So there are not a ton of solar contractors who are capable of building, especially some of like our larger customer solar sites. So there's a lot of overlap from project to project. So as we work more with these companies, they learn our processes. And the fastest way to interconnection really locally is to choose a company that works with the SMUD commercial process on a regular basis. And so those folks, their application is right the first time. We don't have to send their drawings back for revisions required. On the commercial side, we're up at somewhere around like 90% of the first drawings that are submitted have to be returned for revisions. The repeat developers know how to do it right and do what we're looking for. They're familiar with our ESRs. So we have been able to reach out to them and work in partnership with them so that we're both ensuring our mutual customer a positive success at the end of the project.
That's great and super helpful. Lots of great ideas there. So this also open to all panelists. Wanted to touch a little bit more on how your jurisdiction has implemented commercial readiness requirements, such as requiring site control and how that's impacted timelines.
I don't know that has, from our perspective, it's built into what the requirements are, and Katie is really in that team is really good about going, okay, we got your project, here's what you're going to expect, right? It's pretty clear. So we haven't implemented changes to reduce that necessarily, but we do communicate along the way as far as what is expected. So, go ahead, Katie.
No, you're right. Like the issue of site control comes up so infrequently here. Really, it's only been something that I've had to deal with a couple of times over the last several years.
Yeah, I mean, I know there's a couple where we have that broken delta where they're basically we have a relay in place, and if we get a voltage across that resistor, it's going to indicate a fault transfer trip. So we address the one-offs as that if we need to, but it really boils down to what we put in the operating agreement, and that's where we cover it. So it's very clear. It's not inconsistent, right? It's because of this, you have to do this, and here's where it says you need to do that. So we provide that information well in advance of their project. So if they receive that and do what they're supposed to with it, when they get to the end, they're not going to get pushback that something's not done. So it's really just about us communicating, but also that person reading that and implementing what needs to be done. So we see a lot of times that the information's already there. It's just not being seen.
So you're saying this has been in place since the beginning, so it hasn't been an issue so much for your.
Yeah, when we redesigned everything to have it, this more of a dedicated resource to handle some of these commercial, more complex processes, that brought the clarity. So I can't really speak to what it was before that because I was still in metering. I was a different job at that time. So it's how we set it up provides all that clarity, but we don't have something to measure it to, like this made it better. We get less escalations now, so I say that's an improvement compared to before. And we have when we say it's going to take us 6 months to do something, and Katie and team have now the adequate ability to schedule those resources in advance. When we get to that day, these are the ones that go, we have to move it out a few more weeks. We have to move it out a few more weeks. We have to move it out a few more years, right? Or it's not necessarily when we're supposed to be ready, we generally are.
That's great. Thank you. And Hannah, Derek, do you have anything you'd like to share on commercial readiness requirements?
I don't believe that's part of anything within the interconnection process. I do know, for example, for the reformed community solar garden program, they do need to establish things like site control to enroll in it, but that's more of a program requirement, not necessarily an interconnection requirement.
Yeah, and I'm on the same page. I don't know if that's part of what we do.
Okay, thank you. So turning to Minnesota, can you or Hannah and Derek, can you say more about the impact of the stratification of timeline process has had on interconnection queues and timelines, and what challenges have come up since the process was introduced?
You want to
Sorry,
start,
I guess.
Derek? I can talk about some challenges too.
Yeah,
I think actually, I was going to say one of the biggest challenges was just there was an issue with one of the utilities portals, and so they had to there was a whole duplication and everything. But again, that wasn't so much a process issue as it was necessarily a utility specific issue. And I think that that's a thing we've really had to emphasize when we go through and do a review with stakeholders is they'll say, oh, MNDIP's broken. No, it's not MNDIP that's broken. It's like the implementation of it, right? And so I think that that's a really key point to emphasize is that when we can have that breakdown by different utilities, we can really pinpoint, hey, we actually are seeing those timelines improve with our other utilities. It's not an issue there. So then we have to go in and kind of take a deeper dive and see what the root cause of the problem is. But I think that definitely for smaller customers, having those more expedited timelines has been a really huge benefit, as indicated kind of by the data that we had before. But a lot of this is really prompted by utilities weren't seeing large volumes, right? And so of applications. And so I think by doing the process update, it also forced them to go back and look at their own internal processes. And that's, I think, what's had some of the bigger impacts on those timeline reductions is making sure that they're staffed up, they have the appropriate point of contact and everything else.
Yeah, I'll add staffing on the utility side has been, at least in the first couple of years of the implementation, was kind of in contention, as well as interpretations of the MNDIP, kind of a lot of kinks to work out before it was kind of better understood. I'll also add that in addition to the DGWG, we have a DGAG, which is an advisory group. And the idea of that is for utilities and similar stakeholders to kind of go over the complaints that we've been seeing, the processing, and some of the smaller utilities will also kind of learn from Excel and the larger ones of of, like, say, their EV program. It's kind of a space to kind of learn before implementation, and also to kind of address things that are coming up that aren't really technical in nature and more of a process-oriented thing.
I'll maybe note one other interesting thing we saw. A lot of the incentive programs that utilities were running, they would open at the start of the year. And so you would see a flood of applications come in. And so the utilities saw a lot of lumpiness, and that's really hard to staff for versus having a really consistent amount of applications throughout the year. And so started to do some changes to when those incentive programs opened, and that really helped smooth out some of those bumps that existed with the interconnection applications. And so again, a lot of times it's stuff out, having the process is the foundation, but a lot of the things that you're seeing that impact timelines are not actually part of the interconnection process. They are part of all the related issues that come up.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that relates to a couple of other questions I wanted to touch base on. So workforce, for instance, and kind of how stakeholders can manage the outset or the beginning of an incentive program and how that affects queues. So I'll turn first to Ken and Katie to chat a little bit about how your utility addresses workforce constraints to manage changing interconnection queues. I know you touched about that during your presentation, but would love to dig into it a little deeper.
Sure. I'll go first, and Katie, you kind of talked about your end of it, on how you're managing that with the seniors and stuff. So a good example was in the data that I had showed with regard to the application data. We saw a 3,000 to 4,000 increase in applications, almost double what we had received, or at least a third more than what we received the prior year. So the part of the work that we have is the transactional work, where is this application sized correctly, et cetera. So we can augment that with CSR. SMUD has a decent sized contact center, and we're able to bring in, more of an entry level person that can do a transactional work and teach them the screens, what they need to do, et cetera. And within a couple of days, they're usually pretty fluid enough they can knock most of the work out. Then that frees up my team, which is they're senior CSRs, but they've been working in this process longer than someone that's just taking phone calls. So we're able to use them to help support in other areas when they're needed. But it hasn't really gotten to that even during that huge time frame, because what we were seeing is more applications just being submitted in order to get under the wire. So part of that also, we implemented interconnection fees, which is the cost to interconnect, because SMUD cannot create cross subsidies as a utility in the state of California. So we need to ensure that we're not, that our solar customers are paying what is due for us to do their process. That slowed down the applications as well. So now what we're getting is applications that are really truly applications. We look at those fees every 3 years and look at the three-year average costs and adjust them accordingly. They range $475 on residential, $900 residential pair with battery, or over 10 kW, and then the commercial rates are $2,500, $3,500, and $5,000 plus billable costs on telemetry jobs. So we're implementing these things to kind of not slow the market down, but really ensure that what we're getting is true projects. And then from a scheduling perspective, we maintain the expectation of the customers. Currently, our metering team is running a little bit behind because we're right in the middle of a major AMI system upgrade, where we're moving from our first generation AMI meters to our second. So that's impacting the meter tech resources, who is also the people that do the PV installations. So we do our best to maintain the SLA and communicate with the customers if it's going to be impacted. So my team runs a report that goes out to each of our teams that says, here's your SLA and here's everything that's overdue. And they try to make that work a priority the next week. And if they can't, then we should be circling back with the customers explaining what's going on. So, because you just can't add more people when it's a specific technical role. A journeyman meter technician is a 4-year apprenticeship, and we only have so many of them. So we maintain the expectation as best we can, and realizing that the market shifts and we do the best we can to get through it. but you also don't want to create positions or people and then impact them later if the work does go away, because that doesn't look good either. Managing risk, maybe is probably the best way to explain it.
Yeah. So that's a great segue into me, Ken, about the folks that I work with on our project teams. They are all seniors or they are managers of their departments. These are not entry level folks reviewing substation drawings for someone who wants to connect to our subtransmission 69 kV, or reviewing some of these larger commercial customers now that want to have their own microgrid, right? We cannot just put an entry level engineer on it. We can't put an admin on it. So our resources definitely have been constrained, and there are a couple of departments here that are kind of pinch points along the process, and it's well established. And Ken mentioned the meter techs, so I'll just continue to pick on them. There are 3 senior meter techs that we work with, and not only do they help process every commercial application, they are also working on our utility scale solar. They are the only 3 who work on all of our transmission applications as well. And they still go do maintenance, and they still have other things that have nothing to do with any amount of clean power generation. But again, they're seniors. We can't just make them appear.
Yeah, thank you for that thoughtful response. I want to turn back to Hanna and Derek. You mentioned kind of the evolving flows of queue volumes, particularly in response to incentive programs. And so if you could just comment on how queues have evolved over time, and what is the biggest challenge in navigating these volumes kind of in the short term, and then obviously the long term gives the regulators time to address it.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is if you go look at the online queue reports, there are substations that are getting huge numbers of applications, but they're in like my neighborhood, for example, right? South Minneapolis, where they're, 5 to 7 kilowatt applications because of how the process has gotten set up, things like parallel review, they can move forward really quickly. And I think actually some of the incentive issues we were seeing were not at Xcel Energy. It was at one of our northern utilities, Minnesota Power. And so what they did is they changed it to kind of more of a lottery system, because they were just, it was like everybody was submitting at 12:01 a.m. and their system would crash. So I think that there's been some just more policy solutions that have been done. But again, where we're seeing those really backlog queues, it's the same points on the system. And so it's not an interconnection problem. It's more of a, I think, grid planning issue of where do we try and drive people on the system where it's going to have the biggest benefit for the system, and how do we have utilities and regulators and developers all talk together to figure out what that is. Because I am not a renewable development expert. The utility is not a distribution renewable development expert, right? Like, we don't know about things like land availability, what makes an attractive site. And that's not really incorporated into a lot of the spatial forecasting you're seeing right now. So I think queue management is really going to need to evolve to be more than just how much do we think is going to come on, and what factors influence where the solar is going in the future.
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit that land availability and the affordability of leasing that land has kind of been a driving factor of where the solar is placed. And oftentimes, at least in Minnesota, that's not where the demand is or where the load is. And so you kind of have to have those converging things. Also, the CSG program was reworked on by the legislature 2 years ago, and that put some capacity limits on an annual basis, and also had some more requirements for subscriber requirements. It also got rid of, prior to that, we had a contiguous county rule where subscribers can only subscribe to a CSG that's 1 county over at most, and that got rid of that requirement, and that helps some, but I think it's still the main issue is just going to be the upgrade costs and as Hanna was saying, the planning aspect of running the grid.
So yeah, kind of to boil it down, once you're seeing most of your applications go through, the stickiness is not due to the process, it's due to your program design. And so I think that you really have to think critically and carefully about how that impacts things. When things are in statute, it's more difficult to change them quickly. And so how can you give regulators flexibility, give them the guidance you want from a policy perspective, but give them the flexibility to kind of be able to address some of these issues as they come up, I think is really important.
Thank you. That's really interesting points, and it'll be interesting to see as well how solar incentives design can evolve along with proactive planning, as you mentioned in your presentation. I'll just make a note that if folks in the audience still have questions, feel free to enter them in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer those as we go along. All right, and so turning back to SMUD, to Ken and Katie, if you can share some more insights. You mentioned this a little bit in one of your clarifying answers, or answer to a clarifying question. How do automation software tools improve interconnection timelines, and how have you implemented these to improve processes for interconnection in the SMUD territory?
So from our perspective, like the work that my team does, adding API calls and all that stuff to create the work has reduced, the number of errors and really just opened the lines of communication and visibility to the project statuses. That's been the biggest benefit. It's hard to compare to the program days and those, because the volumes just aren't what they are today, right? But if you look at that historical data that I showed and take that farther back, you see everything's going well, 1,500, couple thousand applications a year, and the market's slowly growing. And then SB1 incentives and the Solar Homes for All incentives ended. Huge uptick trying to get on them incentives, right? And then it fell on its face as soon as when 2-for-1 pricing went away, so did the market. So maybe it's slightly falsely inflated by that initiative. Again, my opinion, not no facts there. So, and then the next year, the solar ready initiatives came in. So you started seeing more interconnection applications for homes that were solar ready. The owners came in to buy, and then they want to add solar to that breaker. And then now Title 24 changes. Now all our solar homes are required. So the market's only really being held together by and being driven by those standards, right? So there is a run to the hill whenever the money's impacted, right? So when we were talking about moving away from retail compensation for NEM to solar and storage rate, which is paid at 7.4 cents regardless of time of day or season, that's why we saw 2,000 or 3,000 applications extra in a year, because everyone's trying to sell those systems, because as soon as you start paying your retail rate, your ROI goes in the tank. So what we're getting now is that, hey, we can't make any money on this, and we keep, it's like, well, that's not the intent. The intent is to energy efficiency, size it accordingly to your load. Just because we allow you to go to 110 and 120% doesn't mean you should. How about 65%, store it and never export to SMUD, and you return as much money as possible back to your pocket. So, but the story that's being told, size big, size big, size big. But from our perspective, we want you to size to an energy efficient load. Okay. Just for understanding, I was a journey level meter technician for a number of years, and I managed that group. So I kind of know a little bit about energy. But you talk to a customer, you talk about the existing load they have and the age of their home. You talk about windows, roof, insulation, heat pump, low flow, water, apply all these to your current load, which brings you down to here. Those investments are going to pay off sooner, and then your solar system is also going to pay off sooner because you don't need as much. Driving the customers to make the right decision for energy efficiency and their own return on investment is what serves the customer best, and the direction that I would prefer to go in having these conversations with customers. Because otherwise you'll never break even on the current rates. But that's, you know, SMUD's perspective, and our rates are relatively low. PG&E customers, completely different. You should put in as much as possible because their rates are a lot higher, but there's just, someone has to help the customers with those economics, because that's where I'm finding needs the most improvement, is them understanding the financial considerations that they're signing up for.
All right, thank you. I know we're drawing to the end of this webinar. I wanted to just share a couple of slides just to go over the roadmap again, and a link to those interested in learning more about I2X, and share the upcoming webinar. So we have a link here if you're interested in learning more about the DER Interconnection Roadmap. Again, this covers solutions that are designed to improve interconnection challenges across the US. And you can use this QR code to scan to learn more and sign up for updates. We have another webinar coming up in a few weeks on June 2nd, Clearing the Fog on Interconnection Queues, Increasing Data Access, Transparency, and Security, with panelists from the Illinois Commerce Commission, Michigan Public Service Commission, and New York Central Hudson. So please sign up and learn more about interconnection data access and transparency. There are additional resources available on the website on DOE's Transmission Interconnection Roadmap. So thank you all for joining today. Thank you to our panelists. This was a really interesting conversation, and we learned a lot. Lisa, do you have anything you'd like to add before we close out?
No, just thanks to our panelists and everyone who stuck around.
This is great.
Thank you.
all.
Yeah, thanks.
Take care.
Thank you.